Okay, I would love to talk about Peter Daszak and DARPA and all those leaks that were coming out, or leak, I guess it was one big leak, to Drastic. But I haven't had enough time to process that mentally and to really internalize it and think about it. But what I have had time to do was I listened today to Jerome Powell's press conference summarizing uh, the this month's or this quarter's Fed meeting. I always forget. I guess it's this month's. And it seems pretty clear at this point that the taper has not been canceled. The taper has not been delayed. They're not. They don't seem phased by the Evergrande situation. Now this press conference might age poorly. Perhaps in a couple weeks, the Evergrande crisis spirals out of hand so much that Powell feels like he needs to double down on QE and double it. Currently, QE is at a pace of 120 billion a month, and Powell has said he was going to taper before. We all remember what happened in late 2018. I think it was in December, it might have been early 2019. When he gave that famous press conference in which he said that balance sheet runoff was on autopilot. This was long after the taper, though, I guess. So it's not quite analogous. It was balance sheet runoff rather than a taper, but basically the same thing. But the difference was when Powell said that the balance sheet runoff was on autopilot, stocks tanked. And I think we all know the Fed responds very much to the stock market. That is what their mandate is all about. It's about keeping stocks high. As long as stocks are high and going up, Powell's happy, and he feels like, hey, I'm doing a good job. But if stocks move in the wrong direction to a significant enough degree, Powell is going to completely flip-flop, which is why Powell went all the way from letting the balance sheet run off, letting bonds roll off the Fed's balance sheet, shrinking the Fed's balance sheet, to again going back to QE and growing the Fed's balance sheet at a rate of 120 billion per month currently. And now Powell has made it clear that the committee feels that inflation is significantly high enough and unemployment is significantly low enough in which they should begin tapering that QE. Now, I don't think that this is necessarily I know this is going to sound crazy. I kind of agree with Powell in that Powell was emphasizing that a tapering does not equal a tightening. And I would agree with him on that to a certain extent, because there's two types of QE that the Fed is doing right now. They're buying two types of assets. They're not just buying bonds. They are buying two very specific types of bonds. They're buying treasury bonds, and they're buying mortgage-backed securities. And both of those, buying each of those has a different effect. And I believe the current proportions are 80 billion in treasuries, 40 billion in mortgage-backed securities. And as they taper at a rate of 15 billion per month, that 15 billion is going to come, equally from out of the MBS and the treasuries. So they're going to remain the same proportion of QE as they go down. It's not like they're going to draw down mortgage-backed securities first and then start drawing down treasuries. So getting back to the difference between those two forms of QE, when the Fed buys mortgage-backed securities, they're directly subsidizing the housing market. They're buying mortgages off the balance sheets of banks. They're driving down mortgage rates. They're pumping money into the mortgage market. As long as the Fed's doing this, the banks know, hey, we can write as many mortgages as we want. The Fed's going to come in and buy them. It doesn't matter to us if they go bust later on down the road. Similar situation to what you had before 2008. The banks knew, hey, I don't care if these people are solvent, in 5 years or whatever. The Fed has this massive appetite for mortgages, and I'm going to keep feeding it. And so when the Fed starts to taper their purchases of mortgage-backed securities, which again currently is 40 billion per month, that's 40. When that is completely gone, that'll be $40 billion less that is going into the mortgage market every month. That's $40 billion less that people are going to be able to borrow. It's $40 billion less in demand for mortgages. And so, all else equal, mortgage rates will rise. Now, there might be other factors that keep mortgage rates down or make them fall even further, and I'll get to that in a second. But all else equal, if you cut purchases of mortgage-backed securities, you're going to drive up mortgage rates, which to me is a good thing because I want mortgage rates to rise because I think, well, I shouldn't say I think. I know, everybody knows, real estate prices in most of the United States are ridiculous. They're overpriced. They're unaffordable, and it's absolutely impossible for young people who aren't exceptionally successful to even dream about owning their own home. So that kind of QE, I would say that that's bearish for housing. It doesn't look good for the housing market if the Fed is not going to be as accommodative as they like to say. But when it comes to the Treasury market, tapering is actually bullish. And I've shifted on this because I used to think that, the reason why the Fed is conducting QE and buying treasuries is to directly monetize government debt, which is, partially true. That is, I think that's certainly the Fed's intention. And so therefore, the reason why the Fed is doing it is because they think, without us, interest rates on federal government debt would rise and the United States would go bankrupt and would not be able to continue borrowing and running massive deficits. And frankly, that would be true, or I should say that might be true, if we didn't have the $1 trillion plus in reverse repos being conducted every day. The fact that reverse repo operations are going on is evidence that the financial markets could take on, have an appetite for treasuries. And that were it not for reverse repo, there would be negative nominal interest rates, not just negative real rates, which we currently have, negative nominal interest rates on treasuries. Reverse repo is essentially an unwinding of quantitative easing. And so as reverse repo grows and grows, it is an indicator of how much the Fed can taper its purchases of bonds, or even let bonds run off its balance sheet without interest rates rising at all. Because right now, the Fed is just trying to keep interest rates at 0 or above. That's what reverse repo is all about. And reverse repos have consistently grown, even as the Fed continues to do QE. Now, what makes treasuries so different from mortgage-backed securities? Well, mortgage-backed securities used to be used as pristine collateral in the repo market before the housing bubble burst, and since then, repo market participants don't look as favorably upon mortgage-backed securities because they probably got burned in the last crash, and so now they favor treasuries over mortgage-backed securities, and so treasuries have have more utility than mortgage-backed securities. You can use treasuries to lever yourself up and go and buy risk assets. And I've explained this before. I don't want to get into too much depth about it again, but essentially, treasuries are a tool that banks and shadow banks can use to create money out of thin air. Kind of like fractional reserve banking, you have fractional repo market collateral. Because these treasuries get rehypothecated. People will borrow treasuries and then borrow against the treasury that they borrowed to get cash to go and buy some risk asset that is going to, get them some better rate of return. And so the Fed tapering its purchases of treasuries will allow, ironically, the financial markets to inflate and expand at an even faster rate. It will free up resources. It will free up treasuries to be used in the repo market to be leveraged and to drive up the prices of other assets. In financial markets, treasuries are sort of like the base money that we learn about in a classic fractional reserve banking system. You've got the paper money, and then you've got all the deposits on top of it, and you've got the loans and all that stuff, all that hot air that makes up the inverted pyramid of the monetary system. In the modern financial system, from the way I understand it, the base of that inverted pyramid are U.S. Treasuries. And so as you broaden that base, you're going to be able to expand the monetary system more and more. And that, I suspect, is why we didn't see a taper tantrum today. It's why the Fed was received relatively positively by the markets, by Wall Street. It's because the tapering itself is bullish, at least the tapering of the treasuries. As I said, I don't think that the tapering of mortgage-backed securities is, although mortgage-backed securities do have some repo market utility as well. But there isn't any sort of mortgage-backed security reverse repo operations that I can look at and confirm for sure that the Fed is crowding out private investment in mortgage-backed securities. I don't see how that's the case. So, to be clear, what I'm talking about today, I'm not at all factoring in the Evergrande crisis. That is, I don't like to use the phrase black swan. I think that it's one, overused, and two, it doesn't really describe the sorts of events that people call black swans. I don't think it's a good term, but that Evergrande fits into that category, what people think of as a black swan. And that is a separate issue from the tapering of quantitative easing. I almost said quantitative tightening. I don't want to say quantitative tightening because I think that there is a potential that this tapering actually will lead to an expansion of the money supply within the financial sector. And so I would say bullish for risk assets writ large, but potentially bearish for housing in particular. Housing would be kind of an outlier there because housing has received so much direct stimulus from the Fed in terms of that $40 billion a month in mortgage-backed security purchases. But we don't know how Evergrande and the ripple effects from that are going to affect this moving forward. As the Evergrande situation unfolds, I will try and integrate it more into this analysis, and but the tapering by itself, I wanted to separate it out and try and identify what the effects of that I think will be, or I should say the net effects of it. Because again, when you're dealing with economics, you can never control for all these different variables. In absolute terms, things might necessarily go this way. Housing might go up, stocks might go down. It's not necessarily going to be in absolute terms that this is bearish for housing and bullish for everything else. So with that said, I will see folks back here tomorrow, in which I hope to discuss more about the Wu flu.